Esters. They're a chemical compound that allows us to create artificial flavors and artificial fragrances, and today we'll learn how they're formed. In this lesson, we're going to cover the naming and diagrams of alcohols, carboxylic acids, and esters. So alcohols contain a functional group called a hydroxyl group, just like we had a functional group from a halogenated hydrocarbon in the previous lesson. So the naming of a hydroxyl group is very similar to the naming of an alkane. We're just going to change the suffix ending to ol or ol. And again, this information is in your data grouplet. So there are some alcohols that we're familiar with, like methanol, which is a solvent, ethanol, which can be used in fuel. There's other ethanols that can be alcoholic beverages, glycol, a solvent, and isopropyl alcohol, which is a disinfectant. Now, it's important to note that alcohols that you come across in your science lab or in industrial settings are denatured alcohols and are toxic. So the only alcohol that is safe to human cells to consume, which would be ethanol in the form of an alcoholic beverage that's designed for human consumption. All other alcohols can have some serious biological consequences. So when we're naming alcohols, we want to identify the name of the parent chain. And we're going to do this the same way we did before, find our longest chain of carbons. And like in this case, it is 3. We're going to find the functional group, our hydroxide, and sometimes you'll see it written as OH. So sometimes you'll see -O-H, sometimes -OH. We're going to communicate the location of the functional group, so it's on carbon 2. And if there are 2 functional groups, we want to use diol. So like if we had an OH there and then we had another one down here, but in this case, it's just 1. So the parent chain is propane. Our functional group is on carbon 2. And so our name is propan-2-ol. So here's our information from our data booklet. So it has the classifications of ethanes, alkanes, alkenes, and alkynes. It has the general formula as well as an example of the formula. And all these examples are with the 2 carbons, so all the eth groups. Okay. This is an alcohol, and our functional group is going to be OH. And the R here just stands for a carbon group. So we don't know if it's 1, 2, 3 to 10 carbons. And then we have an example of the naming. So we have ethanol here. Because there's only 2 carbons, we know it's on a first carbon, so we don't have to put any number in there identifying where it is. So again, here are our steps. Find the hydroxyl group on the molecule and circle it. Determine the parent chain of carbons, and start counting the carbons from the nearest end of the hydroxyl group. We want to use the method of naming hydrocarbons to determine the initial part of the name and communicate the location of a hydroxyl group by adding a number in before the suffix that represents the hydroxyl group. So here we want to circle the hydroxyl group. We identify that we have a 1 parent chain. So we have a methanol. There's just 1 carbon. Now our previous example was propan-2-ol. We had the 3 carbons and the hydroxyl group on the second. So we have prop and 2-ol because that hydroxyl group is on the second. And here we have a propanol with the hydrogen or the hydroxyl on the first carbon. So it'd be propan-1-ol, identifying that hydroxyl is on the first carbon. The next compound we're going to talk about naming is carboxylic acids. So this is what a carboxyl functional group is. It has an alcohol onto the carbon as well as a double bonded oxygen. And again, the carboxyl functional group is given as an example on your data booklet. So it could also be written as COOH, but again, it comes off when you're actually drawing it as an OH and then a double bonded oxygen. And we change the end of the parent name to oic acid. So this would be with 4 carbons, butanoic acid. And this is always going to be at the end of our carbon chain, so we don't have to put any numbers in identifying where that functional group is. So our carboxylic acids are Bronston-Lowry acids because they donate a proton. However, they're going to be weak acids because they only dissociate a small amount in a solvent. So here's a reaction of ethanoic acid reacting with water. So we have this hydrogen ion being donated to this hydroxide. The hydronium ion to become the conjugate acid. And then here's the conjugate base of our ethanoic acid. So when we look at the two functional groups present in lactic acid, so lactic acid you'll often get if you exercise past the point where your body can't provide enough oxygen for your cellular respiration to take place in an aerobic environment. So we're producing anaerobic cellular respiration, and lactic acid is a byproduct. So here we have that carboxylic acid as one of the functional groups. And we also have a separate alcohol as a functional group. So there's two functional groups on lactic acid, alcohol and carboxylic acid. So propanoic acid is used to prevent some foods from spoiling. Use the systemic name to draw the chemical structure for propanoic acid. So we're going to look at our prefix prop, and we're going to have 3 carbons. These carbons are going to have hydrogens attached onto them. And our last carbon is going to have our double bonded oxygen and then a hydroxide group as well. And this is our functional group for our carboxylic acid. So is it possible to have the carboxyl functional group on the second carbon? The answer is going to be no, because this is 4 carbon bonds here. So we can't bond to another carbon to have the carboxyl group in the center of the carbon chain. So it's always going to be at the end. So here's a nicer diagram of the chemical structure. Again, we have our 3 carbons. Our first or last carbon is going to be bounded onto the double bonded O and the hydroxide group. And it must be the end of a hydrocarbon chain. So as we name this acid, first thing we're going to do, how many carbons are there? 4. So this is going to be bute. And then we have our carboxylic acid group. So we're going to be bute, enoic acid. Simple as that. Okay, here's an example of citric acid, and it incidentally has 3 carboxylic acid groups as well as an alcohol functional group. So this is a more complex compound that's not named simply through the hydrocarbon rules. We can also look at the naming of esters. Now, esters are exciting because they often create scents and tastes. So these are made up of an alcohol and a carboxylic acid that are bonded together. And this is known as an esterification reaction, which is also a form of dehydration synthesis, because as we're making a new molecule, water is produced. So we have a water molecule that's produced in this reaction and 2 other compounds joined together. Now, dehydration synthesis is also how a fatty acid molecule is combined. So we have water that's removed from this substance in dehydration synthesis. So when we have a chemical analysis, a chemical reaction is going to occur between propanol and ethanoic acid. So we're going to use a structural diagram to show the products and the reactants. So here we're going to remove this water molecule between the end of this alcohol and this alcohol here on the carboxylic acid. So we have water being produced. Then we have a carbon chain that's bonded to an O to another carbon chain, with then that double bonded oxygen on this end. So that's our chemical reaction. We have our carbon chain, an O, another carbon chain, and then a double bonded oxygen on that end as well. Now, to name these, it's a little bit more complicated because we have to go in the right order. So when we're naming esters, We named the end that started with the alcohol first, followed by the branch that had the carboxylic acid, and then we end with O8 because it's the suffix for the ester. So when we look at our ester, this is the end that was the alcohol because there used to be an H right here. So this would be ethanol was the original alcohol. Then here was our original carboxylic acid. So we had methanoic acid. So we're going to combine these. So we're going to have ethyl, is that alcohol? Methanoate, I ran out of room. So ethyl methanoate. And again, we'll see that on the next slide much more neatly. So we want to use the systematic naming of an ester. We have to identify the three parts. Our original alcohol, our original carboxylic acid, and then the ending O8. Okay, so the name of this ester is ethyl methanoate. And again, we don't have to put any numbers into here to identify where the bond is between the two different carbons. So just ethyl methanoate. So drawing the structure of pentyl ethanoate. So pentyl has 5 carbons and ethyl will have 2. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons. Then we have our single bonded oxygen, and this was the alcohol end. Then we have ethanoate, and this was our original carboxylic acid with 2 carbons. And then we can see that double bonded oxygen indicating that it was the carboxylic acid end of the ester. Now, like I said, esters are really exciting because they're able to form flavors and scents. Occasionally they're safe and occasionally they're not. So the alcohols and esters that form the alcohols and acids that form these esters are toxic. So methyl butyrate gives apples their familiar taste, but methanol in and of itself is poisonous, and butanoic acid gives rancid butter its odor. So though the ester is safe, the two reactants that form it are either poisonous and or unpleasant. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on the naming of alcohols, carboxylic acids, and esters. Take care.